Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This is the first one covering episode 3, and I'm going to be covering parts 1 and 2 of my Let's Play. This video is going to contain full spoilers for the entirety of Umineko, so don't watch it, don't listen if you haven't played it, it's not even going to make sense to you. And content warnings in this episode for child abuse, sexual abuse of a child, grooming, extreme grossness related to all of those. I'm not kidding with how serious those are, and really not kidding about spoilers. Don't keep going if you don't know what you're getting into here. We jump right in with some Beatrice backstory, and this is the first time we've gotten very direct information about it. A lot before has been kind of whispers of rumors and ideas of what Beatrice the witch as a figure is, but here we get to talk about Beatrice the human woman. However, we're seeing Beatrice the second. This is a wrinkle that kind of complicates your ability to put together the literal events of what occurred with Kinzo and Beatrice. That confused me because in some ways this is outright spelling out exactly what happened. But because timelines don't line up and because Beatrice uses magical language to discuss things, it's a little bit hard to parse on your first time through exactly what's happening. And speaking for myself, it took a while for me to cop to the idea that Kinzo could have done something so horrible as to create 2 generations of children of abuse. And I'm not talking about the Ashuramia family proper, I'm talking about literally children created from abuse. Let's go through some of the stuff in this backstory, because some of this we're going to get to later, but we begin with the story of the urn. A thing that Beatrice II accidentally knocks and breaks, and then is worried about the fallout. But in looking at it, she talks about the fragility of it being beautiful, and even the fact that it is fragile imparts beauty onto it. And it is very clear that the urn is a metaphor for Beatrice herself, her being caged up, her being a delicate but precious thing for Kinzo, and that in some ways her delicacy is part of the miracle, Kinzo's magic, his hopes and wishes, that if it was easy to make another Beatrice, if he simply wanted a woman to be his secret wife, that would not be difficult, and that would not have the quote-unquote beauty that Kinzo was looking for. Kinzo wants the exact same woman again. And of course, again, we're going to get to this later, but it's pretty clear that this urn, in paralleling Beatrice II in particular, is also a parallel to how Rosa accidentally causes her death. And again, the fragility of people, and in some ways how beautiful a life of a person is as a thing that can be very easily taken away even without any ill intent whatsoever. Rosa's carelessness as a child is still able to lead to a death. We're going to get to Rosa's reactions to that and some trauma that might have imparted to her, but it's important to think about the fact that very unintentional actions can cause harm and damage in a way that does not require any malice. And I think it's worth juxtaposing that against what Kinzo is doing, because Kinzo is not intending any harm with his actions per se, because he ultimately wants a woman he loves and to love him back. But it is clear that the immense, vast reserves of harm this does to multiple people because of his selfish desires. Unlike with Rosa, you can hold him culpable because he is much more aware of his actions in a way that Rosa is not. The key thing with Rosa's accident, and the key thing with this urn here, is that both these people are just interacting with something beautiful that then shatters. Let's focus on this first section now, and we'll deal with Rosa's later, because I haven't actually read that quite yet, although I'm playing ahead, so I'm pretty close. Despite any lack of ill will, Beatrice here in the narration says, "No matter how much I regretted it, no matter how much I apologized, the broken vase would not be returned to its original form." It doesn't matter that Beatrice caused it by accident. It doesn't matter how apologetic she is. She cannot reverse what happened. She cannot undo the accident. She must simply accept it. Here steps in Virgilia as teacher Beatrice to explain how even if the vase itself cannot be unbroken, harm and blame does not have to fall upon Beatrice for this. Because again, as we said, Beatrice had no ill will. Beatrice was curious about the urn. She's quite young in this, it seems, or at least very naive, because we know she is naive later. So it is not hard to look at this situation and feel for her and feel that she should not have to face consequences for a relatively harmless mistake that was done to an inanimate object that has monetary value and aesthetic value to Kinzo, but it's simply not precious the way a human life is. But again, to look even way further into the game, I believe in the answer arcs there's going to be a section where Rosa gets forgiven. I think maybe even by will? I don't remember, but we'll get there eventually. Depending on your point of view, you could easily make the argument that Rosa is not particularly culpable for that accident either. And what Virgilia is offering here with her magic is a way to redirect the narrative, because simply it is not necessary for Kinzo to know exactly how the vase was broken. He was not present. If these were the only two present, there is simple magic to be woven to change it that a cat snuck in. Even though that's what they told Beatrice, but that doesn't make a lot of sense, because why would there be a cat on this secluded mansion, on this secluded island? So presumably a better story was peddled to Kinzo that completely redirected blame from Beatrice, which in a way is very funny to me, because that implies there is a second level of misdirection happening where Virgilia is claiming that a certain spell is being woven while she weaves another one instead, and instead blames maybe herself, maybe one of the other servants, gets somebody in trouble, but somebody who is not Beatrice and can maybe weather the trouble better than this clearly anxious and nervous child. Again, maybe she's an adult here, but she's a child. And the way this magic works is interesting, because we're going to repeat this phrase a few more times, especially in this early section of this episode. Come, try closing your eyes and try to remember. What form did you have? It was a very, very beautiful form. Please, show me that form one more time. Try to remember that form is very interesting, because it implies that the vase itself is meant to hold on to the body that it has lost. Again, obvious parallels to Beatrice herself and her reincarnation, and how memories make the self. That memories are a key component to the being, and that without those memories, it's in the wrong shape. And we'll get to some stuff about Beatrice's backstory later, but just to know that even this early on, the idea of memories making a person, and memories being core to how a person is put together, especially with magic, are worth holding on to. We're even going to see it in a little bit with Battler, when Beatrice remakes him, where she says she can barely remember him, so he needs to do the memory. So he needs to remember himself. Because of course, if Beatrice remakes Battler with her own memories, she is making her perception of Battler, as opposed to what Battler's understanding of his own self is. And those are different things. And it's arguable whether or not you could even say that Battler's own perception of himself is, strictly speaking, the true Battler, but it at the very least is less of a one-sided view of him, because obviously, even if you cannot fully know yourself, you're at least the person who spends the most time with yourself. So. And by contrast, of course, Kinzo attempting to remember the form of Beatrice and imbue that form onto another person maybe does not work quite so well. And something to put a pin in for later, Virgilia talks about how difficult it is to revive things with magic and how really undoing fate is extremely difficult, and that what she can do is temporarily return things to their previous shape and then let them fall apart again. She says that killing is easy. It's far easier with magic to break and kill. That's why weak witches lose to temptation and become intoxicated with gathering easy power for themselves, neglecting their true magical training. Now, I would like to know a bit more about this, and Virgilia does not get into the details, but I suspect this will be extremely relevant as we go through the episode, with Virgilia returning and Eva-Beatrice coming about. So I think this is more of put a pin in that thought for later, and it will presumably tie into what I was saying anyway about the easiness of accidents, and perhaps how easy it is when you also intend to cause harm. How much you can do with very simple actions. In particular, Virgilia refers to her own teacher. And I know there's no literal character of her teacher, but I don't know if there's even meant to be an implied teacher that maybe will be referred to later, or is this just about Virgilia trying to impart the notion of generational knowledge, that even if Virgilia is just offhandedly referring to her mother, perhaps, or something, that we are supposed to just take this as being a lineage and not that there is a specific particular person who has power that Virgilia does. In some ways, this feels like it's just Virgilia trying to impart some of the humbleness that we're not going to see from Beatrice for a while yet. And of course, she talks about endless witches. Witches with the power to mend things endlessly. The concept of breaking doesn't even exist. And again, we're definitely going to see some more of this later, but we have definitely seen it from Beatrice before, especially from the tea party at the end of episode 2, where the act of breaking people and reviving them has very little meaning to Beatrice at this point, because she just simply has the power to kill and unkill and kill again. And at that point, it's like flipping a light switch. Why would you care about turning it off and on and back on again and back off again? And it's interesting that in the narration, Beatrice herself, Beatrice II, hears about this concept of an endless witch and thinks of that as being unlike human life, where you are on a journey where you have to withstand sadness. And we can imagine a lot of the sadness Beatrice II is going through. But that for a witch, they could simply avoid this life. They just simply get to eject out of sadness. And to Beatrice II, that feels like eternal bliss. Even though the witches all seem like they're kind of just bored and looking for some sort of excitement because they have nothing tangible. They have no stakes in things because they are simply endless. And then we're getting some of Eva's backstory, and gender is here in full force. It wastes no time. There's very subtle moments of it peppered constantly through here. Now, obviously, gender roles have already been important in this story, but Eva's backstory is infested with gender. And even before we get to her backstory proper, Hideyoshi and Rudolph have their conversation where they're smoking, and Eva has kicked them both out, and they're just out on the deck. Rudolph is clearly a little bit cowed by this, and in some ways I feel there's an underlying implication of like, hey Hideyoshi, that's your wife, you could just be telling her what to do and not listening to her. And it belies some of the gender roles and it belies some of the gender assumptions underlying some of this stuff, where the implication, generally speaking, is that Hideyoshi, as the man, should be in charge and telling Eva what to do. If Eva's telling Hideyoshi what to do, that's upsetting the balance. She is stepping out of place. She is not knowing her place and is instead being domineering and making him unhappy. And we'll see direct references to this later from Kraus. But to Hideyoshi, he simply loves his wife And if she doesn't want him there because he's smoking, he knows that there is reasoning behind that. He knows that this is not simply some nonsense flight of fancy. He will step out on the deck because he doesn't care that much. It's an inconvenience to have to light his cigarette out there because it's a little bit harder, but it's simply not bothering him, so he will obey a wish from his wife because he just gives a shit about his wife in a way that I don't think Rudolph or Kraus would quite understand. I really like Hideyoshi and Eva, like, in particular, as a couple. In particular, this moment where Hideyoshi is trying to tell Rudolph, like, hey, my wife's not like this all the time, you know. She's aggravated because we're at the family conference. She's honestly can be pretty gentle. And then Rudolph is like, she bullied me a lot as a kid, and she also was constantly picking fights with Kraus, so I just can't have this read of my sister that you have, but you do you. And, like, again, talking about selves, identities, people, and fractured identities, which will be important for Eva very soon. Hideyoshi's wife Eva and Ashuramiya Eva, the child of Kinzo and sibling of Kraus and Rudolph, are not the same person. They are different people. Hideyoshi is quite understanding of that, and in a funny way, Rudolph is almost skeptical of it, as if he can't believe that this other Eva exists, and he can only ever understand his original Eva as the true one, despite the fact that obviously, as a child growing up into an adult woman, Eva has been lots of different Evas, even in the presence of Rudolph and Kraus. And just again to slip in a quick gender note, they refer to Rosa being a CEO they refer to Rosa being a president of a company as a quote-unquote hobby. Now, I don't think it's unfair to say Rosa doesn't care that much about the company she's running. She just sort of did it because she thought it was what was expected of her. But I still don't think that people would say the same about Kraus, despite him being a flounderingly bad businessman. And yet they never refer to Kraus as not a proper wheeler and dealer or anything, because with Rosa, there is the underlying assumption of, well, she should really just be married, especially because she has a child. She's just kind of messed up and has not really taken the proper course. And before we get really into Eva's backstory, Hideyoshi and Rudolph talk a little bit about it, where Eva clearly doesn't like to discuss her history because of how bad it was and how much it still weighs on her, and presumably because of her worries that she has in fact used her baggage to direct her, George, and Hideyoshi's lives. She doesn't like to really dwell on it and discuss it because she's worried that even just talking about it or addressing it at all is going to bring it to the fore, when really the fact that it is an unresolved tension is a large part of what gives her trouble. And it's interesting that even from Hideyoshi, who generally has his wife's corner, he's calling her a fool for openly challenging Kraus. And I don't think that's an unfair assertion to make when you're looking at this from the outside and the events and circumstances and going, why would you do this? Eva, you just make things worse when you're being spiky like this. But the thing you have to think about is, they're not going to take her any more seriously if she is reserved and sits back and does what is asked of her. If she simply does what is asked of her, she gets to be put in the little wife box and ignored, and never gets any say, never gets any of the privilege, respect, or power that she is looking for. You have to remember, she is in a family that has said, more than anything else, money, prestige, and power, these are the things that make our family great. These are the things that our father did that are so goddamn impressive that we should all respect and look up to him. But Eva, no, don't even attempt it. Not one bit of it. Instead, forget about being a person to carry on the legacy of the family. You go make some babies with someone who will be a useful contact for your father so he can get more money for himself. I would honestly not blame Eva for seeing these circumstances and going, I must challenge this, because I don't gain much from giving up. If Eva simply obeys, she doesn't get what she wants ever. She's never going to be rewarded for following the rules, so she learns pretty quickly that the way she can maybe, someday get the reward she's looking for is to simply challenge Kraus. Now, I don't think it was a particularly wise plan long term regardless, but I can certainly understand it being a more realistic option than be a good wife, be a good daughter, be a good little uneducated woman. And it's clear in the section that Kraus is blatantly sexist. I need to pull up a particular line that shows just to what extent Kraus has bought into extreme sexism here. At one point, incredibly agitated and challenging Kraus to try and get him to explain himself, Eva says, "What are you trying to say? That women should be slaves who work for men, so I mustn't be so forward?" And what would you think Klaus says to that? His first line, "It isn't elegant to say it out loud." Klaus is just saying, well, everything you said is true, but you don't need to say it so loudly. I mean, that's uncouth. Acknowledging the sexist structures that our family is organized upon, well, that's just rude, isn't it? But at no point is he in any way contradicting her. He is fully agreeing with what she just posited as a ridiculous sentiment. The worst part is that Kinzo also agrees with what he just said. Klaus got these ideas from Kinzo, and though Eva has had those teachings imbued upon her as well, she's resisting them because she is attempting to forge a better path forward for herself. She is hoping to challenge these to change things because, again, her alternative is to simply not and accept a shitty situation. And as god-awful as Klaus's point of view here is, it's worth thinking about the fact that he is absolutely relying on this structure of sexism because he is a fail son. He is useless. If this was a fully merit-based situation, he would not be getting the headship. He is not qualified, he's not capable, he makes bad business decisions and gets swindled all of the time. He is not a worthy successor, and so, aware and insecure about these shortcomings, his solution is to lean upon something that is an irrevocable difference between him and Eva, at least from his point of view, and something that he is confident his father will not change his mind on, something that he is confident he can use to aggravate Eva and try and put distance between them. Klaus is indeed cornered because he knows he's insufficient, and Eva will not let him forget it for a second because she sees that as her way of getting above him, and so he has only one cudgel to resort to just constantly beat down any argument of hers with. And of course, here we are introduced to Eva-trice, who's not referred to as Eva-trice yet, but in my own notes she is, because that's where she's gonna end up. And the split here is very interesting, and we'll definitely have more to talk about it later, but I particularly like how Eva-trice is written as deeply uncompromising, because it's not just that younger Eva is selfish and self-centered and driven by her goals and will literally say other people should die if they're in her way or not sufficiently dedicated to things, but that she is simply tunnel-visioned on one goal and one thing only. A distinction made between younger and older Eva is that older Eva has grown up, has matured, and one way in which being an adult manifests is that you understand your decisions have context. You understand that there's a lot going on and that you can't simply decide you have a destiny that you're going to follow and target it and doggedly pursue it. At a certain point, Eva came to understand that her father was so deeply sexist that he would simply not be able to let her be the head of his own volition. But that if she thought about the structures around her, the headship, and what options she had available to her, she came up with an alternative path to effectively achieve what she wanted by a different means. Depending on your point of view, if you're a child who simply wants a thing and then sees you not getting that thing, that can only feel like compromise, and not just compromise, but a useless compromise, because you no longer have what you were looking for. And indeed, Eva does not have the headship secured for George. In theory, it is still going to Jessica. But Eva, as an adult, is attempting to use the structures that put her down to upend things so that Jessica will be passed over and the headship could go to George instead. Meanwhile, younger Eva simply insists that she should be the head and that it should happen. And honestly, even before magical power comes into it, I could imagine this younger Eva literally just killing everyone in the way of succession. While later, we're with the kids on the beach, and Jessica and Battler are talking about just their romantic interests. And again, gender returns, because Battler very offhandedly says, like, well, yeah, you've got a style of speech that of course would be off-putting to guys, which Jessica's clearly insecure about and was worried about how much that truly matters. And Battler has some very bad advice, which is, well, if someone sees how determined you are for them to like you, that you change yourself and mold yourself into a more demure and expected role for them, well, their heart will skip a beat and then they'll definitely say yes to you. Now, we know this is just wrong. We know this is simply not the issue with Canon and Jessica's relationship. But more importantly, this again comes right after Battler discussing... This comes right after Shannon obliquely discussing Battler's sin, and is yet another case of Battler just running his mouth, not really thinking or understanding the situation, and not really thinking about, again, the implicit and unintentional harm he is causing through his careless words. And Jessica really takes this to heart, which is the part that's quite upsetting, honestly, that she really starts to think this is on her, and that, again, in the opposite way to Eva, she thinks perhaps she should be more of like a girl and a woman if she wants to have a relationship with the boy she likes. One small note again that is fun is when Beatrice revives Maria's rose and produces a new version of the rose, a new incarnation of the rose, she literally refers to the cage of flesh that the rose's soul was trapped in, releasing the soul so it can be born anew. Again, paralleling what's happening with Beatrice and her incarnations. And this is obviously a way less problematic and much more straightforward version of that, where it is simply a flower, and it's simply Maria has an attachment to what is close to an inanimate object, and Beatrice is using this power of reincarnation to simply bring some joy to Maria, in a far less selfish way than all the shitkins at us. And that mostly brings us to the end. One quick note we have to put a pin in is everyone marches out. All of the siblings go march out to talk to Kinzo. Very important to know what the fallout of that is and whether they clearly don't get to talk to him. Do they get to understand why they don't talk to him? That will be key for the rest of the mystery, so I'm going to be paying attention to that in future readings. But that is it for this spoiler episode. Looking forward to digging through episode 3. Ava's a very good character for poking at like this. And in particular, my first read through, I found the Eva-trice stuff a little bit hard to parse. Plus, I am sure that the mystery this time is going to be more convoluted and involve multiple perpetrators. Or multiple actors, at the very least. As opposed to just accomplices. But we'll find out. We're gonna get to the actual murder times a little bit quicker this time, so that'll be fun. That's all for this video though. Thank you for watching. See you again.